that my parents changed my home. I was home on winter break from college, and I walked into my bedroom, prepared to put my stuff down and breathe a sigh of relief at being home, when I noticed that my bedroom wasn't quite the same. All those knickknacks I'd accumulated, well, they were now sitting in a box in the closet. The large poster that had filled an entire wall, in its place was a nice painting of a peony framed by Georgia O'Keeffe. The antique bed that I'd found in my grandparents' barn and then painted a bright turquoise color all by myself had been replaced by the standard queen-size bed sitting on a nice plain bed frame. I was in the same room that had been my bedroom for 6 years, but it was different. I went upstairs to complain about the changes my mom had made, when out my mom came walking out of their bedroom wearing a brand new outfit I had never seen before or even heard of. "What do you think?" she asked. "It's new." "I guess it's nice," I said. And then I knew that my entire home had been changed and flipped upside down when my brother, my little brother, who I used to boss around and even beat up on occasion, walked into the kitchen, picked up the car keys, and drove himself over to his friend's house to play video games. I had wanted to come home, but my home was not the place that I remembered it to be. It was different. The people had become a bit stranger to me, and they wore some different clothes than I'd seen before. Everything had changed. And I wasn't sure if it was good or if it was bad. Some of you may be preparing to return home for the upcoming Christmas holiday. Or maybe some of your loved ones are returning home to where you live. Preparing to return home tends to warm our hearts and evoke some star-tinged, lovely memories. Even if your home growing up was not so wonderful, you still might be able to wallpaper over the bad memories with one or two good times that you try to have make up for all the bad memories. But we all know, we have all experienced that real life and our real homes are not like imaginary made-for-TV movies with their twinkle and their shine and their happily ever after endings. Our sisters and brothers are no longer so easy to push around. In their place are tensions between siblings with different political or religious views. Our parents get older and frailer and make decisions they may not agree with, or they may not even be with us at all anymore. And the moment we cross the city line driving into our hometown, or walk into the front door of the place where our family gathers, we are confronted with all the memories that come rushing back of the life we used to live with these people, of the celebrations we had, of the frustrations and arguments together, of the tears, and maybe even the sufferings of our life together. A Facebook post rolled across my Facebook feed this week, written to a friend of mine by her sister. This is what it said. "In light of the fact that we have a holiday weekend coming up, in which we will all have to be in the same house for 3 days, I'm calling for a 30-day Medina family truce. Aaron, stop posting ridiculing pictures of guns. Jeff and Brandon, stop commenting all the time on Aaron's posts. Jan, refriend Aaron. Thank you in advance for agreeing to the terms of the Medina family truce." That is what real-life, actual families look like and sound like. I can only begin to imagine that. What it must have been like for the Israelites, for God's people to return home to Jerusalem in our gospel reading for today, after being away from their homes for 50 long years. Last week we heard how God's people, the Israelites, were now living in what had become a barren wilderness for them. The superpower marauding armies of Babylon had conquered their small nation of Judah and toppled the capital of Jerusalem. The temple was torn down, as you heard with the kids, and most of the people, especially the religious and political and cultural leaders, were driven into exile and forced to live and work in the far-away foreign city of Babylon. But before they had left, God had promised to make a highway for them to return home to through the desert. And God had made a promise to their ancestors to give them land to live in, and that God would always be their God. And so this week, in the strangest, most unlikely way imaginable, God keeps God's promise to those Israelites this week who have been kicked out of their homes. When the new king of the new marauding superpower, the King Cyrus of the Persian Empire, is stirred up somehow by a God he doesn't even worship. And he proclaims in his kingdom that after 50 years of exile, God's people can return to their homes in Judah and rebuild their toppled temple in Jerusalem. But something happened to God's people while they were away from home. Something must have happened to them, because when they do return home after journeying through the desert to get back to Judah and Jerusalem, it's not just that the city of Jerusalem has changed while they were away, but God's people start to act differently as well. We've been following the story of the people of the Old Testament this fall. We eavesdropped as God first promised the elderly Abraham and Sarah an impossible son who would be the ancestor of the great nation of Israel. We were frustrated while Moses tried to lead some whining people through the desert into the promised land after they were freed from slavery in Egypt. We danced with King David when he returned the Ark of the Covenant, the dwelling place of God, to Jerusalem. And we recoiled as prophet after prophet, Isaiah, Hosea, and Elijah, yelled from the mountaintop to call God's unfaithful people back to God. All fall. God's people have been represented by one-man band leaders, by one lone hero who over and over calls God's people back to God and represents them in faith. Moses, King David, Isaiah, Elijah, one person at one time. But when those Israelites came back from exile, when they made their way through the wilderness and came back to their homes, there was no more one lone leader. Because besides Cyrus, that foreigner king of Persia, there's no lone hero who steps up to save God's people today. No super faithful individual who shows everyone else what it means to live this life of faith. Instead, while God's people were out in exile, while they were waiting and wondering when they got to go home, God's whining, unfaithful individuals have been transformed into one big collective of saints and sinners, into the people of God, all come together into one body, flaws and all. If you look at your gospel reading, you will notice that never once is there the word I or the word of one person alone acting. In fact, here's what it says, sort of condensed. After the Israelites returned home, The people gathered together as one body in Jerusalem. And then they set up the altar together. They offered burnt offerings. They celebrated the festival together. They sang praise and gave thanks to God. They shouted to God, and they, plural, everyone, wept for the wounds and disappointments of the past together. The wilderness, the time away from the comfort and the status quo of home, has changed God's people. God has come into their years of struggle and abandonment and brought them together, so that never again will they have to suffer and cry alone. They will never again have to try to be faithful all by themselves. Now they are one body, one people of God together. Today, Alani Alvarez, who's sitting up here, will be baptized into God's community of faith. Her baptism will make today's worship service longer than it usually goes. Those of you who don't know Alani very well or came just for worship today may be thinking, goodness, why couldn't we do baptisms at another time? I don't like when worship goes long. I want to get home and watch the game or call up my sister. And those of you who are joining us in worship today, primarily because Alani is being baptized, may have been sitting here this morning as you stood and sat and sang and said some strange words and thought, why couldn't we have just come in and sprinkled her with water and be done with it? Why do we have to gather with all these strange people we don't know? Why do we have to do all this other stuff like singing and praying and stuff? Because, dear people of God, we do this together on a Sunday morning because we are more like the Israelites who lived 2,000 years ago than we might think. Because like them, we don't follow God very well all by ourselves. We'll end up wandering off in the wilderness alone, and you and I both know it's nearly impossible to survive the wilderness by ourselves. We can't worship God very well on our own either. We need the voices of others to make our off-key singing come together into angelic-sounding harmonies. We need sisters and brothers who drive us batty, who we even disagree with, who have different opinions. To help us remember that we are not always right, that we are not perfect, and we need others to show us new ways of living out this faith. We need each other, like the Israelites needed to come together to get themselves back home and rebuild the temple. We need each other to live this life of faith, to keep watch in the wilderness for the new way that God is coming into our world. And we certainly need each other to do the work of God to rebuild this tumbling down world that is so in need of some faithful rebuilding. And only then, when everyone has a place, when everyone has a voice, and when we become one body, the living body of Christ, alive and at work in this world, will we ever begin to come home and to become the kingdom of God. This morning you are home because you are together and you are worshiping God. But as you go out, I invite you and encourage you to invite others to come home as well, and to open your arms and your heart so that together we may become the family of God, one body, now and forever. Amen. Amen. During the season of Advent, it's a season of waiting. It's a season of all these words that you see on the walls. You may be used to tinsel and glitter and Christmas exploding all over the place, but in the church, we wait. We hope and we expect for God to come. And so during the season of Advent, you'll see that next in worship in your bulletin is a time for prayer and reflection, for you to sit and wait Or you can also come up here on the table over here. There are some flames. If you need to write a prayer or to say some words to God, you can come over here and there's some pencils and prayer flames, and then you can put them up on the banner. So I'll invite you now into a time of expectant waiting and of prayer.